Hello everybody and welcome to my wrap-up for November. I believe with my November TBR I estimated that I would be able to read about 5 books. I more than doubled that and I ended up being able to read 13 books and a few, I think 3 short stories, and I kind of filmed my wrap-up video as I was finishing some of these books in a couple different segments, so you'll see that kind of spliced together, and we'll see how that turns out in the end. But yeah, here are the stats for the books that I read this month, number of books, the number of stars, my average star rating. As I go through the video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about each book and my thoughts on it, and if at any point you want me to make a specialized video for any of the books that I talk about on this channel that don't have their own specialized video, let me know, and I'll work on that, and I can make a specialized review video for whatever book interests you the most. Without any further ado, let's jump straight into my November wrap-up. Okay, so the first book that I finished this month was not something that I'm happy about, so we'll start this on some of the negative stuff so we can get better further on. The first book I finished this month was that Smoke book by Dan Villetta. That was the book where any sins that you thought or said or did visibly manifested themselves in the smoke. I actually made a big rant review of that book. I didn't like it. I'll put the link up in the doodad wherever that goes. Yeah, I was not a big fan of that book. You can see more of my thoughts on that there. Also, I finished The Eye of the World, the first book in the Wheel of Time series. Man, was that a doozy. It's a huge, hefty, chunky book, but it was cool. There were some weird things about it that I didn't necessarily expect, which was the pacing I thought was strange. It was really fast and then slow, and then fast and then slow, and then fast and then slow. And there was a lot of interesting things during the fast part, and during the slow part, there wasn't as much world building as you would kind of expect during the slow part. I don't know, I thought parts of it dragged, parts of it were awesome. I ended up loving it. I ended up being disappointed that because of the way that I have my TBR and everything set up, that I wasn't able to jump straight into the second one, because I was really looking forward to just bouncing right into that second one, but it just didn't work out that way. But yeah, I ended up really liking that first book. I gave it 4 stars. It does a lot of things. I've heard a lot of people say that it follows the tropes of like Lord of the Rings a lot, because he kind of wanted to reimagine Lord of the Rings, and there's a lot of similarities in that first book, but I've heard that it divulges later on. I ended up, like I said, really liking it. I liked the setup, kind of with the prelude, is that what it's called? The big part at the beginning before the main story, and then some of the world building there ended up being really cool as well. I read a book called Bad Memory by Lisa Gray, which was the second series in the Jessica Shaw series. I liked that. It was a fun read. Those are typical, like, it's about a private investigator named Jessica Shaw who is kind of a drifter, and she's bouncing around, and there's some repeating characters from the first book, and I thought that was kind of cool. It's not my favorite thing, but it's also kind of a nice palate cleanser. It was on Kindle Unlimited for free because I have that service, and so it was a nice thing to read. Just a good murder mystery, interesting. If you like that kind of thing. For me, a huge release this month, and one that I've actually been looking forward to for a while, was The Lost Colony, which is the 3rd book in the Long Winter Trilogy by A.G. Riddle. I actually, once again, made a big video about that trilogy and how it's like one of the best things that I read this year. It's like a sci-fi book where it starts off and there's like another ice age coming, and there might be aliens, and there's space travel, and lots of sci-fi cool goodness. It goes places. It's really good. Watch that video, please, if you are interested in that. I don't want to, once again, repeat myself too much in this video. I also finished the Basic Bible Interpretation. I think it was by Roy B. Zuck. And that book was interesting. For me, it was a little bit of maybe a refresher instead of being like completely new things. The book starts off with a lot of church history and the different hermeneutical methods that people have used to interpret the Bible through history. Which actually kind of like went really well with the church history book. I'll talk about a little bit later. But then it goes on to continue into the hermeneutic that it presupposes is the correct hermeneutic, one that I would subscribe to myself, which is the historical, grammatical, literal hermeneutic of interpreting the Bible. And kind of the methods on which you would do that and how to handle different passages. There's a lot of like basic grammar and basic like really basic literary interpretation. So, like, hey, if there's allegories, you interpret them as allegories. If there's literal things, you interpret them literally. Yeah, there's some challenging things. But yeah, it's a good, it was called Basic Bible Interpretation. It was good at doing that. Also, I was able to get to The Silent Patient this month. This is a book that has been on my radar for a very long time. It's like the #1 book on Goodreads, and I really liked it. I was able to pick it up, and what a crazy ride that one is. If you haven't heard of it somehow, a girl shoots her husband 5 times in the face for no reason. No one understands why. She paints a picture and then goes silent for 7 years. She's in a mental institution, and a person tries to, like a psychotherapist tries to cure her or, help her heal. And it's a very interesting thriller mystery. I really liked it. Also, made a review for that one, and I'll link that in the description below and also up here. Now, both The Silent Patient and this next book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I actually read for a reading challenge, which is the Triwizardathon reading challenge that I actually heard about from Mystery Date with a Book. You probably know who that is. I'll link her channel below if in case you don't. She has a great energy with talking about books. It's a really fun channel. You should check it out, of course. But yeah, this is my very first book challenge, and it's really Harry Potter themed. And there's you pick a different school based on the month that you were born, and then there's different I've never done a reading challenge, but I'm guessing it's pretty basic, where there's different categories of books that you have to read during the reading challenge time, and then you add all your scores together and see who wins. And so one of the books that I had to read was a historical book, which I very rarely do, but I wanted to pick something that was shorter so that I could make sure to fit it into the week, because my reading is really sporadic sometimes. So I read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I'd never read before, and it was a little hard for me to do because the language is just very different than contemporary writing, of course. But it was an interesting story. I ended up liking it. It was a lot more directly, it was a way more direct social commentary than I maybe thought it was going to be, and that was kind of cool. But yeah, thanks for reading challenges, for making me read things that I never normally would read. And speaking of things that I would never normally read, I've been watching a YouTube channel called the CodeX Cantina, which has 2 guys on it called Una and Crypto, and they do literary discussions on classic short stories and books. I've been following along with their kind of series where they're talking about different short stories, and I read 3 of the short stories they talked about. Here, I'll link their channel below. This month I read Dry September, My Old Man, and The Rocketman, all short stories I never would have picked up, but because of those guys, I was able to pick them up and kind of hear the historical context talked about, as well as the themes historically and in the story that I may have not caught on. 1, I wouldn't have ever read them. 2, I wouldn't have ever understood the historical context. And 3, I probably wouldn't have picked up on the way that those intertwined with the story's fictional themes in a way that's really smart and intelligent and above my level. You should check those guys out. Now, I finished a big whopper of a book called Church History in a Plain Language, which is a church history survey. So a big global, but more surface level, but it's still a huge book. Look at church history from the time of the apostles to now. And I started that book because 1, I thought it was something that I should know more about. And 2, I kind of thought that it was going to be something was encouraging to read about, or I don't know why I thought that, but it was probably, the book was good. The content was a much bigger bummer than I really was fully ready for at the time when I read it. And just watching the way that the church just disintegrates and morphs, and the way that humans screw things up incessantly was just super depressing for me. And the way that over time so many things changed and got worse, and then some things would get better and other things would get worse, and unity was all but destroyed in the church. If you've studied church history before, these things are so obvious, but as a Protestant, that's not always really focused on. So it was good for me to see some of this stuff and see the way that doctrine has evolved over time, and different points where people try to look back to what the apostles are teaching versus the Catholic Church kind of advancing things for seemingly good intentions, but bad things that got worse and worse things that got even worse. And just the general overview of that was a huge bummer for me. I don't like to be pragmatic, especially when it comes to matters of the Bible, but if you are the type of person that believes that the church is going to usher in the kingdom, that seems like a very hard theology to hold to based on the history of that subject matter. Now, Blake Crouch is an author that he was like basically the author that got me back into reading. And so I kind of have been working through his books. I made a video on Recursion. It was one of my favorite 2019 books. And his other book that everyone talks about is called Dark Matter. I decided that I should read that one as well. A lot of people were talking about that. Sarah Hart's books, I'll link her channel below. Also read that this month, and it was awesome. And I want to make a review video. I have an idea, a kernel in my mind of the way I want to cover that book. It deals with it's a science fiction thriller. It deals with a lot of like very common tropey science fiction things. I have a really maybe good idea, maybe bad idea in my head of the way that I want to review that book, but I have to like do a lot more work than I normally do for my videos, and I just have to figure out a way to make that work, and we'll see if it ever comes to fruition. I really want to make it happen, but that was an awesome book. I ended up giving it 5 stars. I loved it. I can't talk about it that much. I also don't want to mess up my video ideas, so that's all I'll say. Okay, as you can see, maybe you can't tell, I'm recording this on a different day, which is why I look a little bit different. But I have a lot to get through in November, and so I was kind of trying to keep things fresh and also keep things rolling. And also I keep reading a ton of books in November, and so I'm recording this at a different time. The next book I want to talk about is Sojourn, from the Legend of Drizzt storyline. R.A. Salvatore wrote it. These are well known. There's a ton of, there's like 30 some books in this series. The character of Drizzt is like a dark elf who has a conscience and he wants to be a good guy. And I love this series. It is the chicken soup for the soul, but also like comfort food, but also like blockbuster popcorn flick for me. Like, there's nothing crazy innovative being done in these books, but I love them nonetheless. They're heartwarming, and I can't put them down once I pick them up. And I hate the bad guys, and I love the good guys in the it's just a great series for me. I love the way that this caps off the beginning of Drizzt's life. I didn't realize that this was a prequel, or I didn't realize that he wrote this after he wrote I think he wrote this after he wrote the Icewind Dale trilogy. I didn't realize that. I normally like to read books in publication order instead of chronological order. For some reason, that's the way I like to do it. I didn't do that. And I don't know what that means because I haven't read the Icewind Dale trilogy yet, but I loved the first 3 books here. I think it was Homeland, Exile, and Sojourn. I love the way that this capstones off that trilogy. Honestly, if I didn't have such a huge TBR, I would be pushing to like just read the next book in this series because I really do love it. And it's one of those books where if I spend some time away from the series, I kind of put it down in my own brain and say, well, it's not that good. Like, it's good, but it's not that good. And I read a bunch of awesome books. I say, well, I'm not going to like that one, but I need a palate cleanser. And I pick it up and it's awesome and I love it. I really don't have a lot of negative things to say about it, except like it's not the most innovative series, but I love it anyway. So I capped that off. Loved that. Recommend it if you're looking for some like just feel good fantasy, especially if you like Dungeons and Dragons, which is the world that it's based in. The Forgotten Realms, I believe is what it's called. I love that whole thing. And so that was good. And I'm looking forward to reading the next parts of just story. Drizzt, I can't say his name, as we go forward. Next, I wanted to read through the book Children of Blood and Bone. I've seen that lots of places. It seems really interesting. I love fantasy, and I love the European focused fantasy that we have. I love meat and potatoes, wizards, dwarves, elves, all that stuff. I love it. But also, we're talking about fantasy and magic. I also love the idea that there can be lots of other cultures with their mythologies and fantasy like settings that we can have. And Children of Blood and Bone seemed, honestly, the synopsis reminded me a little bit of like Black Panther. And now that I've seen the author talk about her book in interviews, she kind of makes some comparisons there. It was really good. There's a lot of complex things that you could talk about with that book due to the nature of its themes. and also just its setting and some of the imagery there. I don't know if you want me to dive into that. I feel like everyone's probably talked about that book. It's been around a long time. If you want me to make a special book or a special video on Children of Blood and Bone, let me know. In fact, if you want me to make special videos on any of the books that I've talked about in this wrap up, let me know down below. I'm not sure what people are looking for. I feel like you kind of know the style of video that I make at this point. So if you're looking for that style of video with any of the books that I've talked about, let me know in the comments down below. All right, I'm down to the last 2 books of my wrap-up video. I read both of these books for the second challenge of the Triwizardathon reading challenge. I think I talked about that earlier in the video. I actually had commented on Mystery Date with a Book's post that I didn't think I was going to get this finished, and I ended up somehow miraculously being able to finish both these books. It just happened that one of them was really short and I didn't realize it. So I'm going to be talking about the 2 books that I read for challenge 2 of the Triwizardathon. And I'll talk about the one I didn't like first. That way I can end on a positive note. So one of the bigger booktube channels that I've seen, one of the kind of channels that got me into booktube is Murphy Napier, if I'm saying that correctly. And she's getting into audiobook narration. And she talked about a book called On Lunatime on her channel at one point. This was one of the first audiobooks that she narrated. The premise of the story sounded cool, which is that it was a time-traveling romance story where a girl, she goes back in time to the 1940s and she falls in love with a guy. And I thought this would be an interesting, semi-lighthearted read, and I just didn't end up really clicking with it. The writing style, it was a self-published book, and I don't want to bash self-published books, but the writing style it felt kind of all over the place with tone and feel. I felt like it was super insta-lovey in a way that I didn't like. I had a hard time, maybe this is because I read the second book I'm talking about is a real period piece, and this one is attempting to be part of a period piece, but it just didn't feel very authentic in that manner. I don't know. I don't want to bash on it. It wasn't horrible. I enjoyed my time reading it, but at the same time, I'm in no hurry to read the second book in this series, the On Lunatime book. So I ended up giving that 3 stars. I finished it yesterday, I think, or today. I don't remember. And this also is being filmed very weird. So I finished it. It was the last book that I finished this month. And unfortunately, I just didn't love it. Now, the other book I'm going to talk about. So I specifically like the idea of reading challenges because they force us to read books outside of our comfort zone. I may have mentioned that previously in this video. And so for this video, I was I chose for one of the tags to read a romance novel, and I wanted to read a classic romance because this is not a genre that I ever would read normally, not a genre I'm very familiar with, something that would stretch me intellectually, and as it's also a thing that my wife really is into, period drama television. She loves, her favorite show is called The Midwife, which is more recent, but she likes Dark Rise to Candleford, those kind of shows with old-timey historical fiction. And so I thought maybe this is just a way that I could do something that she was into. And so I chose the book North and South. Had no idea what it was going into it. I'd seen some positive coverage about some friends on Goodreads that had read it semi-recently, and I decided I was going to pick that book. Now, as someone that hasn't read very much in the last, 10 years, and as someone that has read a lot of modern books, especially, there's a lot of caveats with regards to super easy narrative flow that I just discounted when trying to pick up a classic. And it was really hard for me to read this book. Just the floweriness of the writing, the old style of writing, it was really hard to read. And I'd seen some of that in some of the short stories that I read that I mentioned earlier. But it was just really hard for me to read. And it was a big book, but it took me a very long time to read it. I was struggling actively. And I also got the audiobook. I was doing both kind of at the same time. If I drive, I listen to the audiobook, and then it syncs up my progress with the written book, Kindle book, ebook. And it was just kind of tough. I had a really hard time following it at first. And also, I wasn't used to, that's the whole thing. It was very much a period piece, and I had to get used to the period. I ended up actually coming around on liking it, and it had a lot to say about different classes at the time, and the factory workers and the masters. And it did a lot of really interesting things with actually bringing up the pros and cons of both sides. And the main character worked really hard to try to get the two sides to talk together so they could actually understand each other, which I think is a very admirable thing. Also, it was a romance story, and so there was some romantic elements, and I don't know, I just felt it was a weird sort of romance story where I ended up really liking where it went to at the end. But along the way, the main character, Margaret, is a very sweet and caring lady who has to pick up a ton of responsibility when everything around her starts falling apart. But she is just kind of a jerk when it comes to dudes. And like, this is not to say that just because a dude wanted to suit her, she had to accept that by any means. But she did not have to be just a cold-hearted killer the way that she was. Basically, anytime any male showed her like the slightest bit of common courtesy or attention, she kind of just like is real mean about it. But it instantly it comes around. I ended up liking it. I have a lot of thoughts about that book. I don't know if anybody would care about a designated review of that book. Out of another sidehand note, because I was reading this and realized that it was a BBC miniseries that came out a while ago, I decided to watch it with my wife, and I have a lot of weird thoughts about the differences that they made. Like, some of them make a ton of sense because you have to kind of smush it together to make it fit inside the miniseries. But some of the characterizations, they just straight changed, and it really changes the feel of the story. Some of them make sense and some of them don't. Like I said, I could get more in depth in that if that's something you guys are interested in. But I really ended up liking that book. I gave it 4 stars at the end of the day, and I'm happy I read it, and I've ended up talking about this book with my wife a ton. So, mission accomplished, I guess. Whew. And that is the conclusion of my November wrap-up video. That was a crazy wild ride. I did not expect to read that many books, and I don't expect to read that many books in times going forward. But I was glad I was able to do that, and hopefully you guys were able to enjoy it. Some of that sounded interesting. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you aren't subscribed to the channel, but you're interested in my thoughts on books going forward, please give that subscription button a little click. And if you hit the notification bell, you'll get notified when I post new videos. If you want to, you can check out my December TBR. I filmed that and posted that recently, so you can see the books that I'm going to be looking forward to for December, which is mostly a fantasy theme. Just kind of hitting some of the major fantasy books that have come out that I missed when I wasn't reading very much. I hope that everyone that is in the United States, or everyone that celebrates Thanksgiving, had a great Thanksgiving. I'm getting excited for the Christmas season. I'm looking forward to celebrating that. And also, I mentioned in another video that I have a baby that's due very, very soon. And so we'll see how that affects everything in my life and how well that fits with BookTube and work and everything. But thank you for watching my video. I hope to see you again. Have a great week. And so I'm offering this simple phrase to kids from 1 to 92. Although it's been said many times, many ways, Merry Christmas to